Alerted to a betrayal by a street girl, a millionaire fakes being deceived to set a trap and expose his partner and assistant during a final meeting, turning the tables and having the culprits arrested. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. The underground parking garage was steeped in a heavy silence, broken only by the distant echo of footsteps and the constant hum of fluorescent lights. Ricardo Vasquez, the millionaire founder of the Vasquez Tech Group, walked to his car with his mind occupied by the numbers and contracts of the next day's meeting. Everything seemed normal until, as he opened the door of his black BMW and slid into the driver's seat, something completely unexpected happened. A small, firm hand covered his mouth. Ricardo's eyes widened, instinctively ready to react, but he froze when he felt the gaze of the person behind him. A girl who couldn't have been more than 9 years old stared at him with wide eyes full of fear, but also of urgency. Her low, sharp voice cut through the silence. "Be quiet. Don't say a word. They might be listening." Ricardo, a man accustomed to commanding rooms full of executives, investors, and journalists, felt his heart pound in a way it hadn't in years. The small hand and the child's desperate expression held him in a suspense that made no sense. Who was she? What did she want? Clara Mendez, as he would only find out later, was trembling nervously, but her hand remained firm. Her braided hair swayed as she looked back toward the immense company building. Her voice dropped even lower. "I heard them, your partner and that blonde woman. They said that tomorrow you won't have anything left, that you're going to sign papers without even realizing it." Ricardo blinked, trying to process. His partner, Eduardo Moreira, his assistant, Patricia Noguera, people he had trusted for years. The girl spoke as if she had seen a ghost. He finally gently pushed her hand away and whispered, "How did you get into my car?" The cleaning lady left the door open when she left. "I hid because I saw them talking upstairs." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "They laughed at you. They said you're just an obedient little puppy, and that tomorrow everything will be theirs." The words hit Ricardo like a punch. A knot formed in his throat. For years, he had believed that loyalty was the foundation of everything. But now a street child was warning him about the greatest betrayal of his life. He tried to stay calm, but inside, panic began to grow. Who was this girl to risk so much? Why warn him? Clara seemed to read his thoughts when she added, "My grandma always said, when you see someone being stepped on and you can help, you help because tomorrow it could be you." Ricardo took a deep breath. In the rearview mirror, the lights on the 10th floor were turning off one by one. Eduardo and Patricia were likely coming down. They believed their plan was perfect. What they didn't know was that an unlikely warning had just turned the game around. And Ricardo, for the first time in a long time, didn't know if he was about to lose everything or start fighting like never before. Ricardo kept his hands on the steering wheel, but didn't start the car. His heart was pounding so hard, he could feel his blood pulsing in his ears. The girl remained in the back seat, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror as if she expected someone to emerge from the parking lot at any moment to drag them away. "Do you have any idea what you're saying?" he whispered, trying to sound calm, but his voice broke. Clara shrugged as if she were already used to not being taken seriously. "I heard every word. They said that tomorrow you're going to sign without reading, that you'll smile, think you're rich, but by the time you realize it, it'll be too late." Ricardo gripped the steering wheel tightly. Eduardo Moreira, his partner for almost 20 years. Patricia, his loyal assistant who knew his schedule, his passwords, his habits. It was absurd to imagine they could betray him, but the girl's gaze didn't seem invented. It was the look of someone who had seen danger up close. "Why were you up there?" he asked, frowning. "How did a child manage to hear this?" Clara took a deep breath, as if she had repeated that story to herself many times. "I sometimes hang around the hallways at night. I sleep wherever I can find space. The guard doesn't care, he pretends not to see me. Today, when I passed by the meeting room, the door was ajar. They were talking loudly, laughing at you. I hid. If I hadn't heard, you'd be lost." The words echoed inside him. Lost. Ricardo felt a shiver run down his spine. He didn't want to believe it, but recent memories began to align like puzzle pieces. Eduardo's way of pressing him to trust more and review fewer documents. The times Patricia seemed to have too much access, the interrupted conversations when he walked in. Suddenly, Clara leaned forward and whispered with even more intensity, "Look." She pointed to the rearview mirror. Ricardo saw the reflection of two silhouettes passing through the entrance of the parking lot. He immediately recognized Eduardo's confident posture and Patricia's elegant stride. His stomach churned. "They said you'd be here right now," Clara whispered, shrinking into the seat. Ricardo almost started the car, but held back. If he drove off in a hurry, he'd draw attention. He needed to appear normal, but sweat was already dripping down his forehead. He swallowed hard and asked, "Why are you helping me? What do you get out of this?" Clara took a moment to answer. Her large, moist eyes gleamed in the dim light. "Because I know what it's like when no one believes you, when people treat you like you're invisible. They were talking about you like you were stupid, and that made me mad." Ricardo turned to face her and for the first time in a long time felt a lump in his throat that didn't come from business, but from humanity. This girl with nothing to lose was giving him the greatest gift, the truth. And on that night, he began to wonder if the entire empire he had built was about to crumble because of the blind trust he had always had. Before we continue this story, remember to subscribe to the channel and comment your name and what city you're watching from. Ricardo kept the car off, as if starting the engine would awaken a nightmare from which he could no longer escape. He felt his hands sweating and his chest tighten, while the image of his partner and assistant coming down from the building burned in his mind. Eduardo, the man with whom he had shared dreams and business for 2 decades. Patricia, who seemed so loyal she knew every detail of his routine. And now that girl said the two of them were ready to destroy him in a single day. Clara, huddled in the back seat, seemed even more attentive than he was. Her eyes shone like headlights, watching every shadow in the parking lot. There was no ordinary fear there. There was survival. "I don't know what to think," Ricardo murmured. "I spent my life believing in loyalty. I built everything on a foundation of trust." Clara raised her chin, her voice firm despite her age. "Sometimes the people who smile at you the most are the ones who want to see you fall the most. My grandma said a snake only bites those who get close." The word sounded like a slap. Ricardo had always believed that generosity was strength, but now he felt like a fool. How many times had he heard Eduardo telling him to relax, to let him handle the negotiations? How many times had Patricia made him sign papers with colorful markers, guaranteeing it was just routine bureaucracy? He took a deep breath, trying to push away the knot that was growing in his throat. "You said they laughed at me. What else did you hear?" Clara squeezed her hands in her lap, hesitated, then spoke. "They said you don't even notice things, that you trust so much it's too easy to fool you." The blonde woman laughed. "She said that tomorrow after you sign you'll have to look for another job." Ricardo's chest burned. The empire he had built with effort seemed about to be snatched from his hands. And the worst part, by the people he believed in the most. He turned and looked intently at Clara. The girl didn't look away. For an instant, he saw in her eyes something he hadn't seen in executives, advisors, or investors. Truth. "You risked your life to tell me this, didn't you?" he said, surprised by his own emotion. Clara gave a half-smile, tired but sincere. "If I had stayed quiet, tomorrow might have been too late. I know what it's like to lose everything with no one to defend you." Ricardo felt a shiver. For the first time in years, someone who had nothing to gain was on his side. And even though she was just a girl, Clara might be the only one capable of saving him from the fall. Ricardo drove slowly out of the parking lot, the headlights illuminating the cold city night. The silence between him and Clara seemed to scream louder than any words. At every corner, his mind spiraled, replaying conversations, meetings, laughs that now sounded fake. It was as if every gesture from Eduardo and every smile from Patricia had gained a hidden, poisonous meaning. "Are you sure about this?" he murmured, still afraid to believe a story that would change everything. "Feu could have been mistaken, Clara." The girl sighed deeply, settling into the back seat. "I know when people are serious, and I know when they're talking bad about others. They laughed at you. They planned everything. It wasn't a joke." Her conviction made every word weigh like lead. Ricardo took a deep breath, staring at his own reflection in the rearview mirror. The elegant, confident man he used to see wasn't there anymore. In his place was a tired face marked by doubt and betrayal. I spent my life believing that trust was strength, he said, almost to himself, but maybe it was just naivete. Clara leaned forward, her face illuminated by the passing streetlights. It's not wrong to trust. What's wrong is not realizing when they're treating you like an idiot. My grandma said that when someone calls you a friend while preparing a trap, they're not a friend, they're a predator. The words hit deep. Ricardo thought of how many times Eduardo had hugged him in public. How many times Patricia said, "Trust me," as if repeating a mantra. The truth began to seep in like water through cracks. Impossible to contain. If what you say is true, they don't just want to fool me. They want to completely destroy me, he murmured. Clara just nodded, serious. Minutes later, Ricardo parked in front of a nearly deserted cafe. He needed time to think, to organize the avalanche that was crashing down on his mind. He ordered a coffee, while Clara devoured a sandwich, with the hunger of someone who didn't know when she'd have another meal. The contrast between them was painful. He, a millionaire surrounded by luxury. She, a child accustomed to surviving on scraps and in dark corners. Suddenly, his phone vibrated. A message from Eduardo. "Ready for tomorrow, partner. It's going to be historic. The Japanese will love it." Ricardo showed the message to Clara. "He pretends to be a friend," she said with irony, "but behind your back, he's sharpening his knife." Ricardo took a deep breath. This was no longer just suspicion. It was confirmation that the girl wasn't lying. He needed proof. He needed someone he could truly trust. And a name came to his mind. Otavio Ramos, the former investigator whom Eduardo had fired under the excuse of budget cuts. Maybe he was the missing piece to turn the game around. As Clara finished her sandwich, Ricardo made the decision that would change everything. He would not be the victim. The next morning, Ricardo woke up with a heavy head and swollen eyes. He had slept little, disturbed by the memory of the girl covering his mouth in the car and the cruel phrases she had repeated about Eduardo and Patricia. Sitting at the table, he poked at his breakfast without appetite, while Clara watched in silence wrapped in a blanket he had found in the closet. The child seemed out of place in that luxurious apartment, but her watchful gaze missed nothing. "Aren't you going to work today?" she asked, biting into a piece of bread. Ricardo shook his head. "If I show up there now, they'll notice something has changed. I need to be careful." Clara looked at him, serious. "Or maybe you need someone who knows how to play this game. Who do you trust?" The question sounded like a challenge. Ricardo thought of old colleagues, company directors, even distant relatives, but no name gave him a sense of security until the memory of Otavio Ramos sparked. The former investigator had been fired by Eduardo with the justification of budget cuts. At the time, Ricardo had believed him without question. Today, that decision sounded different, almost like a calculated move to get rid of a man who asked too many questions. "Otavio," he murmured. He might be the key. A few hours later, he parked in front of a modest house in a distant neighborhood. Clara had insisted on coming with him. Ricardo hesitated, but the girl's firmness convinced him. When the door opened, Otavio appeared with the same tough expression Ricardo remembered. A 45-year-old man with a scruffy beard, watchful eyes and hands marked by scars. He squinted when he saw Ricardo. Then his gaze shifted to Clara, curious. "I thought you'd never look for me again," Otavio said, crossing his arms. "What happened?" Ricardo took a deep breath. "What happened is that maybe you were right all along." They went inside. The simple living room contrasted with the luxurious offices Ricardo frequented. Clara sat discreetly in a corner, but observed every detail. Ricardo quietly explained everything the girl had heard. Otavio remained silent, only nodding from time to time. When he finished, the former investigator let out a short, humorless laugh. "So they finally showed their fangs. I already knew Eduardo wasn't trustworthy. And Patricia. I always had the impression she smiled more than she should." "I need proof," Ricardo said, his voice firm for the first time since the night before. "If I go to the meeting tomorrow with nothing, I'll be lost." Otavio looked at Clara. "And you, little one, aren't you afraid of getting involved in this?" She raised her chin. "I'm afraid, but it's worse to stay quiet and watch someone get stepped on." The investigator raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You have courage. Maybe more than a lot of adults I've known." Ricardo realized at that instant that he wasn't alone. The game was starting to change. Ottavio opened a worn folder on the table and took out an old laptop, full of faded stickers. He turned the device on and, as the files loaded, looked at Ricardo with seriousness. "You came to me late, but not too late. Eduardo and Patricia have been planning this for a long time. I bet there are already trails if we know where to look." Ricardo ran a hand through his hair, distraught. "They know my every move. Patricia organizes my schedule, my documents, even my trips. Eduardo knows how I think. It's as if I handed them the keys to my life." Clara, sitting nearby, frowned. "But if they know everything about you, you also know things about them, don't you?" Silence fell. Ricardo realized he had never thought of it that way. He knew habits, vices, secrets he had always ignored. Ottavio smiled slightly at the girl's perceptiveness. "This little girl is right," he said. "Traitors almost always leave clues because they believe no one will look." For hours they went through old records. Clara helped, holding notes, asking things that made Ricardo reflect. What seemed childish revealed a surprising logic. At one point, Ottavio found something suspicious: bank transfers to an unknown company created just 2 years ago. "Look at this," he said, turning the screen for Ricardo. "Nogueira Consulting. Registered in the name of a distant cousin of Patricia's. Amount moved, 5 million. Ricardo felt a pang in his chest. "I never authorized that." "Of course not," Ottavio replied. "They disguised it as international consulting fees." "It's pure and simple fraud." Clara's eyes widened. "So it's true they're stealing from you?" Ricardo clenched his fists. Every line of those statements was like a stab. The empire he built was being torn apart from within. And to think that Eduardo always talked about a friendship like brothers. Ottavio continued the search and found even more. Contracts signed electronically at times when Ricardo was traveling. Phantom clients created to justify transfers. A complex network, but not invisible to a watchful investigator. "They don't just plan to fool you in the merger," Ottavio explained. "They've already siphoned off millions. Tomorrow's meeting is just to end the game, forcing you to sign papers that legitimize everything. After that, you'd be discarded." Ricardo leaned back in the chair, the weight of the revelation crushing his shoulders. But looking at Clara, he saw that she didn't seem scared. On the contrary, there was firmness in her eyes. "See?" she said. "I wasn't lying, but now you have a way to fight back." Ricardo took a deep breath. The flame of hope, once extinguished, began to rekindle. Maybe there was still time to turn the game around. Night fell heavily over the city, as Ricardo, Ottavio, and Clara remained seated around the table, surrounded by notes, printed statements, and screens full of evidence. The air was thick with tension. It was as if every word spoken could be heard on the other side of the wall, where invisible enemies waited to attack. "They have an advantage because they believe you're blind," Ottavio said in a firm voice. "Going into the room tomorrow pretending ignorance will buy you time. The key is to behave exactly as they expect." Ricardo frowned. "In other words, like an obedient idiot." Ottavio nodded. "Exactly. Pretend you're still the same man as always, but behind the smile you'll have to be prepared for the final blow." Clara, who had been watching everything in silence, raised her voice. "My grandma said a snake only feels safe when it thinks no one sees it. So you have to let them believe they're hidden." The girl's words echoed in Ricardo's mind. It seemed absurd to depend on a child at such a critical moment, but she saw truths he had ignored for years. "And how will we expose everything?" he asked, his voice filled with contained desperation. Ottavio opened a folder and took out a small recorder. "We already have evidence in the documents, but we need something irrefutable. The confession. They're arrogant, they like to talk too much. Tomorrow, if you provoke them, they'll give themselves away." Ricardo took a deep breath, imagining the confrontation. He felt the weight of 15 years of partnership with Eduardo and a decade of blind trust in Patricia. Now every remembered smile sounded like poison. "What if it goes wrong?" he asked in a low voice. "What if they realize I know?" Ottavio looked at him, serious. "Then you lose everything, not just the company. You'll carry the mark of naivete forever." The silence was broken by Clara. "But if it goes right, it'll show that you're not weak. It'll show that you don't let yourself get stepped on." Ricardo looked at her, surprised. This girl who slept in shelters and hid in dark hallways now seemed to be the voice that had been missing inside him. "You have too much courage for your age," he said, almost in a whisper. Clara shrugged. "When you have nothing, you learn that courage is the only thing they can't steal." Ricardo closed his eyes for an instant. When he opened them, the decision was made. The next day, he would face Eduardo and Patricia with a smile on his face. He would pretend to be vulnerable, but at the right time he would reveal the trap. The silent war had begun. The clock struck 10 a.m. when Ricardo entered the Vasca Tech Group building. The cold air conditioning was not enough to stop the sweat on the back of his neck. Each step through the lobby seemed heavier than the last. Employees smiled and greeted him as always, not knowing that on that very day the company's destiny would change forever. In the mirrored elevator, Ricardo faced his own reflection. The impeccable suit hid a racing heart. He needed to appear calm, naive, exactly as Eduardo and Patricia expected. It was a dangerous but necessary performance. When the doors opened on the executive floor, Eduardo was already there, waiting. Smiling, charming, the partner opened his arms as if welcoming a brother. "Ricardo, sleep well? Today is the big day." Ricardo forced a smile and returned the hug, even as his stomach churned. "Slept peacefully, partner." "I'm excited." Patricia appeared right behind him, holding a leather folder. Her smile seemed maternal, but her eyes shone with the coldness of someone hiding secrets. "Good morning, boss. I reviewed all the contracts, marked them with yellow post-its as always. Just sign." Ricardo nodded without showing anything but confidence. Inside, every word sounded like poison. As he walked down the corridor toward the conference room, he felt vibrations in his pocket. A short message from Otavio. "We're ready. Clara's with me." Ricardo took a deep breath. He wasn't alone. In the room, the table was already set. Water bottles, organized folders, screens ready for the presentation. Eduardo pulled out a chair for him with the air of a host secure in his victory. "The Japanese arrive at 2, the partner said, adjusting his jacket. "Until then, we just need to review the final details." Patricia placed the folder in front of him and discreetly slid a golden pen close to his hand. The gesture seemed small, but it was the culmination of years of carefully planned betrayal. Ricardo kept his face calm, pretending not to notice the subtle pressure. He opened the folder, pretending to examine the papers. His heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his face serene. "It's a lot of bureaucracy. It's a good thing I have you two to guide me." Eduardo laughed. "That's what friends are for, right?" Inside, Ricardo felt his blood boil. Friends. That word, once sacred, now seemed like a rotten mask. He knew that in a few hours he would have the chance to tear it off. At a cafe near the building, Otavio discreetly adjusted the headphones connected to a small recorder. On the table, he looked like just another customer working on his laptop, but every movement was calculated. Beside him, Clara watched with attention, her eyes too alert for a child her age. "Can you hear them?" she asked in a low voice. Otavio nodded. "Yes, the microtransmitter I put in Ricardo's pocket is working. Every word from Eduardo and Patricia will be recorded. If they're arrogant enough to incriminate themselves, we'll have enough ammunition." Clara rested her chin on her hands. "They're going to hang themselves, aren't they?" "They are, little one." Otavio gave a rare smile. "But we still need a direct confession." Back in the conference room, Ricardo continued his role as the naive man. Eduardo spoke with enthusiasm about the profits that would come with the merger, while Patricia opened graphs on the projector, explaining technical clauses that supposedly weren't worth reviewing. "Ricardo, here's one of the main points," Patricia said, tapping a page with her polished nail. "If you sign today, you'll ensure the Japanese see you as a trustworthy leader." Ricardo leaned in, pretending to have difficulty understanding. "I confess these terms confuse me, but that's why I have you two, right?" Eduardo laughed, satisfied. "Exactly. You never had to worry about bureaucracy. We always left that in our hands." The words spoken with pride came through loud and clear on Otavio's headphones. He typed quickly, recording the time and snippet. Clara stretched to peek. "They're digging their own graves, aren't they?" "They are, little one." Otavio smiled from the corner of his mouth. "But we still need the direct confession." Suddenly, Ricardo's phone vibrated discreetly. Another short message from Otavio. "Keep going, they're close to incriminating themselves." Ricardo took a deep breath, keeping his expression neutral. Patricia started talking again, her voice sweet, hiding the poison. "Trust us. Tomorrow you'll be able to rest. Just imagine a peaceful retirement far from your worries." Ricardo looked up, holding back his anger. "Resting? That sounds tempting," Eduardo added, without realizing the trap he was creating. "After tomorrow, you won't own anything anymore. But believe me, we'll take care of the company better than you ever did." The recorder captured every syllable. Ottavio and Clara exchanged glances. It was the missing piece. The clock on the wall was nearing noon when Ricardo realized he couldn't drag out the charade much longer. With every fake smile from Eduardo, every sweet and poisonous word from Patricia, his blood boiled. But he had to wait. Victory would come at the right moment, and any rush could ruin everything. He slowly flipped through the contracts, feigning indecision. Inside, he remembered the sleepless nights building the Vasquez Tech Group. The first clients won with difficulty, the debts that almost sank him, and the times he believed Eduardo was more of a brother than a partner. Now all those memories seemed distant, tinged with the bitter taste of illusion. The conference room felt stifling. The air conditioner hummed, but it didn't relieve the heat burning in his chest. Outside, the late morning sky reflected in the tall windows, creating a white light that was blinding. That space, once a symbol of achievements, was now a stage for betrayal. Patricia leaned close to him, her voice as smooth as poisoned honey. "Ricardo, trust me. I've reviewed every detail. Everything is perfect." He looked up, forcing a smile. "I know I can count on you, I always have." The phrase came out filled with irony, but she didn't notice. The gleam of self-confidence in her eyes showed she was convinced the trap was ready. Eduardo, beside her, drummed his fingers on the table, as if unable to contain his anticipation for victory. Meanwhile, at the cafe across the street, Ottavio reviewed the recorded snippets carefully. Clara munched on a cookie, her eyes restlessly fixed on the screen. "They've already said horrible things. Why isn't it enough yet?" "Because we need them to talk about numbers, the money they siphoned off, the plan to take over," Ottavio explained patiently. "The more details, the stronger the case will be." Clara crossed her arms and replied firmly, "They talk as if he's an idiot." "That should be enough." Ottavio smiled wryly. "Maybe we should have more kids in place of lawyers." In the conference room, Eduardo raised a glass of water and toasted in the air. "Tomorrow will be historic. We'll finally take control. And you, Ricardo, will be able to rest without carrying this weight." The phrase landed like poison, but Ricardo kept his face serene. He feigned a laugh. "Rest, that does sound good." His phone vibrated again. Another short message from Ottavio. "We're ready." "Almost there." "Hold on tight." Ricardo rested his hands on the table, taking a deep breath. He looked at Eduardo, then at Patricia. At that moment, he no longer saw them as partners or friends. He saw disguised predators, believing he was the perfect prey. But what they ignored was that the silent lamb had already grown sharp fangs. And when the moment came, they would be the ones cornered. At 2 p.m. sharp, the elevator doors opened, and 3 Japanese investors emerged on the executive floor. They wore impeccable suits, every gesture filled with politeness and formality. Eduardo practically jumped out of his chair to greet them, a wide smile on his face, as if he were the true owner of the company. Patricia followed right behind, adjusting the leather folder against her body, while waving with a posture that mixed reverence and false modesty. "Welcome," Eduardo exclaimed, bowing slightly. "It's an honor to have you here at this historic moment." Ricardo remained seated for a few seconds, taking a deep breath. Then he stood up, greeting them with firmness. His handshake was confident, but his mind was racing. He needed to balance the image of the leader he had always been with the appearance of naivete that was part of the game. The Japanese sat at the table, discreetly observing the environment. One of them, Mr. Tanaka, adjusted his glasses and commented in halting English, "We hope this partnership brings mutual benefits." "Certainly," Eduardo replied, rushing to open the presentation slides. "Vasquez Tech is ready to take the next step." As he spoke, Patricia placed the contracts in front of Ricardo, discreetly pushing the golden pen near his hand. The gesture seemed small, but it was the culmination of years of carefully planned betrayal. Ricardo maintained a calm expression, pretending not to notice the subtle pressure. He opened the documents, turning the pages slowly. Inside, he remembered Clara's words. "They think you're an obedient little puppy. Prove you're not." Across the street, Ottavio was following everything through his earpiece. Clara, restless, swung her legs under the cafe table. "They're almost telling him to sign, aren't they?" "They are," Ottavio confirmed, keeping his eyes fixed on the recorder. "But he knows what he's doing. This is when we need to have nerves of steel." Back in the room, Eduardo leaned in and whispered in Ricardo's ear, as if giving a friend's advice. "Sign without fear. After today, your life will never be the same." Ricardo held the pen, letting the silence hang for long seconds. Everyone watched, him anxiously. Eduardo and Patricia exchanged glances of victory. The Japanese waited, serious, and Ricardo inside felt that the show was about to begin. The curtain hadn't fallen yet, but the stage was set. Ricardo held the pen between his fingers, twirling it slowly, as if he were undecided. The silence in the room seemed deafening, and even the hum of the air conditioner sounded louder than normal. Eduardo and Patricia exchanged glances, certain that they were about to witness the final victory. But instead of signing, Ricardo calmly closed the folder and looked up. "Before we proceed," he said in a neutral tone, "I'd like to share something with everyone." The phrase, although simple, was like a lightning bolt in the atmosphere. Patricia immediately stiffened, her fingers trembling slightly on the leather folder. Eduardo tried to play it cool, smiling tensely. "Of course, Ricardo. If you want to give a speech to the investors, feel free." Ricardo adjusted his tie and walked to the head of the table, positioning himself so that all eyes were on him. 15 years ago, I founded this company on the idea that trust was the foundation of any partnership. I believe that loyalty and friendship could be stronger than any contract. The words echoed through the silent room. Patricia bit her lower lip and Eduardo crossed his arms uneasy. "For a long time," Ricardo continued, "I thought I didn't need to look at the details. I trusted too much. And as they say, when you're not paying attention, there's always someone ready to take advantage." "Ricardo," Patricia cut in, trying to sound firm, "I think we should stick to the merger. The investors didn't come here to hear... They came here to hear the truth," he interrupted her firmly, looking straight at her. The Japanese exchanged silent glances. Mr. Tanaka frowned, adjusting his glasses. The youngest, Mr. Sato, leaned discreetly forward, visibly intrigued, while the third, Mr. Yamazaki, who had not spoken at all, scratched his chin, watching Ricardo's every move with attention. Eduardo cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "What is this all about? Are you nervous, Ricardo? We all know you've never liked bureaucracy." Ricardo smiled almost imperceptibly. "That's true, Eduardo. I never liked bureaucracy, but I've learned that ignoring it can be very costly." Across the street, Clara's eyes widened as she listened through Ottavio's headphones. "He's starting, isn't he?" she whispered. "Yes, he is," Ottavio replied, recording every second. Now is the moment they start sweating cold. In the room, Ricardo slowly opened another folder, different from the one Patricia had placed in front of him. It was thicker, full of documents and colorful dividers. As he placed it on the table, the sound echoed like a muffled thunder. Eduardo and Patricia turned pale. Patricia reached out as if to stop him, but recoiled. "And what would that be?" Eduardo asked, his voice wavering. Ricardo looked at the two of them firm. "Let's just say it's the real contract. The contract of truth." Ricardo calmly opened the thicker folder as if in no hurry. He took out a stack of documents held by metal clips. The sound of the paper being placed on the table made Patricia shrink in her chair. Eduardo maintained his forced smile, but his hands were drumming against the table, betraying his anxiety. "These are internal reports," Ricardo said, turning the pages for everyone to see. "Suspicious transfers, fake contracts, shell companies. 2 years of a meticulously constructed scheme." The investor's eyes narrowed. Mr. Tanaka leaned in, looking at the papers with seriousness. "This is very serious." Eduardo laughed, but his voice sounded nervous. "Ricardo, what are you doing? These papers don't mean anything, it's just your interpretation." "Interpretation?" Ricardo held up another sheet, showing a signature identical to Eduardo's on a contract for a phantom company. "This is your signature, Eduardo. Do you recognize it?" The silence was deafening. Patricia cleared her throat, trying to find a way out. There must be some mistake. Ricardo didn't let her finish. The mistake was believing you could fool me forever. His voice was firm, cutting. I trusted you. I gave you power, access, opportunities, and you repaid me by trying to destroy me. Across the street, Clara was excitedly clapping her hands on the cafe table. I knew it. Now they have no way to escape. Otavio, more contained, was smiling wryly. It's just the beginning, little one. Their fall needs to be public and final. In the room, Eduardo no longer hid his anger. You set a trap for us. Ricardo remained calm, his gaze as penetrating as a blade. No, Eduardo. You dug your own grave. I just brought the shovel. Eduardo's shout was still echoing when the room door opened slowly. The metallic creak of the hinges sounded like thunder amidst the suffocating silence. Everyone turned, surprised. Ricardo just kept his calm expression, as if he already knew what was coming. And then, to everyone's astonishment, a little girl with black braids walked in, accompanied by a social worker. Clara. Patricia's eyes widened so much they almost popped out of her face. Eduardo took a step back as if he had seen a ghost. What? What does this mean? He stammered, his voice trembling, sweat dripping down his forehead. Ricardo leaned slightly forward, introducing her with the serenity of someone showing their final card. Gentlemen, this is Clara Mendez, perhaps the most unlikely, but also the most important witness in this entire story. Clara walked firmly to the table. Despite her young age, her posture conveyed a courage that unsettled those present. The social worker's heels echoed behind her, but it was the girl who dominated the room. She placed a cell phone on the table and said in a clear, firm, almost defiant voice, I was hiding when they said they were going to fool Mr. Ricardo. I heard everything. I recorded it too. The phrase landed like a bomb. Patricia turned white as paper, her breath short, her hands trembling with nervousness. Eduardo tried to laugh, but his laugh came out strangled, an empty sound that betrayed his panic. You're going to believe a street child? Just some girl. Ricardo didn't answer. He just gestured to Clara. The girl touched the cell phone, and in seconds the room was filled with the voices of Patricia and Eduardo. He's a sentimental idiot. Tomorrow he won't have anything left. It was Patricia. Her cruel laugh echoed through the room like poison. Right after, Eduardo's voice emerged, filled with contempt. 15 years pretending to be friends with that imbecile. It'll be worth every second when I see his face losing everything. The silence that followed was suffocating. The Japanese investors were stunned. Mr. Tanaka clenched his hands on the table, his gaze cold. Mr. Sato sighed, shaking his head in disapproval, while Mr. Yamazaki closed his eyes as if witnessing an irreparable shame. Patricia put a hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face, smudging her makeup. Eduardo tried to form words but just stuttered, unable to regain his composure. Clara raised her chin, her eyes shining with determination. I saw how you talked about him, as if he were invisible, but my grandma always said, when someone is being stepped on and you can help, you help. The whole room held its breath. Eduardo exploded. This doesn't prove anything, it's just a setup. But his voice no longer had strength. Ricardo let out a slight smile. It's not a setup, Eduardo. It's just the truth. And the truth always finds a way to appear, even through the hands of a child. The door of the room had barely closed behind Clara when it opened again, this time with force and determination. 2 federal police agents entered, followed by Otavio, the private investigator Ricardo had called days before. The sound of their boots echoed on the marble floor, filling the room with unquestionable authority. Otavio, Ricardo announced, his voice grave and firm. I brought the complementary evidence. It's all here. He held up a bulky folder full of reports, spreadsheets, emails, and bank statements. Beside him, one of the agents was already holding a warrant for their arrest. Patricia let out a muffled scream. No, this can't be happening. Tears were now flowing in rivers, smudging her expensive makeup, and her mask of coldness had completely crumbled. Eduardo tried to react, hitting the table with the palm of his hand, making some papers fly like dry leaves. This is a staged circus. No judge will accept this evidence. I know the law, I know influential people. He bellowed, his voice choked, but already without the same confidence. Otavio didn't flinch. You do. And that's exactly why we were so thorough. Every transaction, every fake contract, every siphoned-off dollar is recorded. The Japanese gentleman will have a detailed copy of everything, and so will justice. The investors, who had been watching in silence until then, began to murmur among themselves. Mr. Tanaka was the first to speak. Looking directly at Ricardo, "We thank you for your transparency. It has become clear who is worthy of trust at this table." Ricardo just bowed his head in a sign of respect, but his eyes never left Eduardo and Patricia. "For years, I considered you part of my life, and you repaid me with betrayal. But today the mask has fallen." The agent advanced toward Eduardo, who instinctively recoiled. "You are under arrest on charges of corporate fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. Everything you say can be used against you." Patricia collapsed into the chair, sobbing loudly. Eduardo tried to break free, muttering disjointed insults, but soon had his wrists cuffed with a metallic click that echoed in the room like a final sentence. Clara watched everything, her eyes wide. For an instant, Ricardo feared the scene was too much for her, but the girl clenched her fists firm and watched the villains being led away. "They're not going to hurt anyone else, are they?" she asked softly. Ricardo knelt beside her and replied gently, "No, Clara. They're not going to hurt anyone else." As Eduardo and Patricia were led away by the agents, the investors remained in respectful silence, as if they were witnessing not just a scandal, but also a life lesson. Some even nodded discreetly to Ricardo, acknowledging the strength he had shown. And deep down they all knew this was not just the end of a fraud, it was the beginning of something much bigger. A new chapter that was born from the ashes of betrayal. A few hours later, the meeting room was empty. The silence was almost strange, as if the space still held the echoes of the commotion that had just happened. Ricardo remained seated at the head of the table, taking a deep breath, feeling the weight of years slowly being replaced by a new sensation, freedom. Clara was beside him, absent-mindedly toying with the cell phone she had used to record the evidence. The girl seemed tired, but her gaze shone with something Ricardo hadn't seen in anyone for a long time: hope. Ottavio entered, carrying a few more documents. "It's done," he said, placing them on the table. "Eduardo and Patricia will be prosecuted. The press is already reporting it. Their reputation is over." Ricardo nodded slowly, and the company, the investigator smiled wryly, "Stronger than ever. The Japanese cancelled the merger, but they didn't break with you. On the contrary, they're even more interested. Other investors have already requested meetings. Everyone was impressed with your stance." Ricardo took another deep breath. It was as if the weight of 15 years of naivete had finally lifted from his shoulders. He looked at Clara, who was now eating a piece of chocolate someone had given her. "You know," he began, "I always thought my greatest talent was trusting people, and that's what almost destroyed me." Clara looked up, serious, as if she were older than she really was. "My grandma said that trusting isn't wrong. What's wrong is trusting those who don't deserve it." The simplicity of the phrase hit Ricardo like a revelation. He smiled, running a hand through the girl's hair. "I think your grandma was a very wise woman." Clara shrugged, but her eyes teared up. "She said that sometimes life puts us in strange places just so we can find the people who really matter." Ricardo felt a knot in his throat. For the first time in many years, it wasn't a contract, nor a negotiation, nor a financial victory that made him feel alive. It was that child sitting next to him, reminding him that not all wealth is measured in numbers. Ottavio cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I think in the end you gained more than you lost, Ricardo," he agreed. "Yes, I gained something that no money can buy, a reason to believe again." Outside, the city lights shone as if announcing a new beginning. Ricardo knew there would still be battles, but he was no longer alone. He looked at Clara, who was smiling shyly, and said in a low voice, almost like a promise, "From today on, you will never feel invisible again." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, as if she had finally found a home. And so, in the same place where betrayal had almost destroyed everything, a new story was born, not of power, but of trust, family, and hope.